Throughout 2025 and into 2026, so much of the focus on Ukraine's wartime strategy has been placed on its deep strikes. Rightly so, as those strikes have cost Russia billions of dollars while whittling away at Vladimir Putin's war machine. However, that focus on deep strikes also means that many have missed a shift in Ukraine. 3 shifts, in fact, all of which are combining to deliver compounding strength to Ukraine. Putin is powerless to stop what's coming as Ukraine is getting stronger, right at the point where Russia's weaknesses are being exposed. All of this is according to Professor Darin Gerdes, who is a tenured professor of business at Charleston Southern University, in addition to running the Professor Gerdes Explains YouTube channel. Gerdes claims that there is a trio of turnarounds that showcase how Ukraine is moving into 2026, with the intent to do things in very different ways as it continues its fight against Russia. You'll discover what all 3 of those new strategies are as the video progresses, with the third in particular being very important to Ukraine's longevity. But the core idea behind Gerdes' analysis is that Ukraine is compounding strength through its 3 new strategies, and we see hints of this in the long-range strikes that it's conducting. Gerdes recounts drone attacks on an electrical substation in Moscow, attacks on air defense assets in Crimea, and many similar strikes, all of which demonstrate Ukraine doing something different. Something that amounts to the first of the country's 3 new strategies, accelerating the development of internal technology. Gerdes highlights this point by discussing recent comments made by Ukraine's Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov. On January 15th, Censor.net reported on comments that Fedorov made, where he claimed that the top 50 of Ukraine's 400 drone units account for 70% of all enemy hits in the war. Fedorov used that point to highlight the possibilities of the future, noting that Ukraine's development of the other 350 units would lead to a catastrophic casualty rate for Russia. Gerdes sees the same as what Fedorov indicates that he sees through his comment, and the professor claims that what he sees is indicative of a switch in Ukraine's approach to war. Now that's the Pareto principle right there, Gerdes exclaims. For those who don't know, the Pareto principle is also known as the 80-20 rule, which states that 80% of the consequences come from 20% of the causes. The number doesn't quite align in the case of Ukraine's drone units, but that doesn't matter so much as the evidence that this principle is in play. And so growing them into even better and better, and growing the drone units from 5% to maybe 10% or even higher of the Ukrainian army, that's what's going to be important, Gerdes claims. Both men have points. For as effective as Ukraine's drone operators are, they don't make up a particularly large portion of the Ukrainian army. By February 2024, Ukraine had trained around 20,000 drone operators to fight in the war. The number is likely higher now, though it's also likely that some of these operators have died as a result of Russian attacks. However, the point remains that 20,000 or so amounts to a tiny sliver of the 900,000 active soldiers that Ukraine has in its military. You could double or triple that number, and drone operators would still amount to a fraction of Ukraine's armed forces. If Ukraine invests more heavily in training operators who can position themselves in relative safety behind the front lines as they wreak havoc on Russia's assaulting forces, it has the potential to massively ramp up casualties on the Russian side. But underpinning this growth in the number of drone operators is Ukraine's focus on developing its own technology. As a business professor, this warms my heart to see the way that we're working at this asymmetrically, because I can see the value they're bringing to the war, Gerdes says. He goes on to point out that Ukraine's growing use of asymmetric and cyber strikes is making the war too costly for Russia to fight in the way that Putin wants to fight it. The verified December losses of 35,000 Russian soldiers that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has revealed were all caught on video. Ukraine has built interceptor drones to take out Russia's Shahid types, which Zelensky claims are going to become a huge part of Ukraine's air defense strategy going forward. Even in the realm of artificial intelligence, Ukraine is well ahead of Russia in terms of making AI work for it, Gerdes claims. What we see here is that Ukraine has spent the last few years building strength and developing its technology to the point where it's become the sort of military powerhouse that Putin always feared that it could be. There's a great irony here. One of Putin's stated reasons for invading Ukraine was that he wanted to demilitarize the nation. He's done the exact opposite. Russia's war against Ukraine has transformed Putin's enemy into one of the strongest, most technologically adept, and increasingly self-sufficient military forces on the planet. Ukraine's defense industry has grown to an estimated capacity of about $35 billion since the beginning of the war, and it has the potential to grow larger with proper investment. The drones that Ukraine is building itself are responsible for the majority of the casualties that Russia now experiences. By September, almost 60% of the weapons that Ukraine was using to defend itself against Russia were being made domestically, which is massive for a country that had to rely so heavily on foreign aid when Putin launched his invasion. What we're seeing here is the militarization that Putin claimed was happening, accelerated to a point that Russia can no longer do anything to stop it. The results on the battlefield speak for themselves. Record numbers of Russian soldiers are being killed by Ukraine's short-range drones. Ukraine is hitting targets at long range, including oil refineries and military stockpiles that Russia relies on to keep troops and equipment moving into Ukraine. The switch, along with the change in strategy, is that Ukraine has constantly adapted to the war in front of it by bringing as much of its weapons and technology manufacturing in-house as possible. Yes, it still receives aid from its Western partners, and that aid is vital, as you'll discover in a moment. But the country is increasingly becoming self-reliant, which also means that it's increasingly immune to the often turbulent geopolitical situations that surround it. Accelerating internal tech has been huge for Ukraine, but so has the second of the three strategies, working better with its allies to ensure that they feed Ukraine smarter and faster. Gerdes points out that Russia has also been adapting its strategies, with its constant attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure during the winter representing a switch of its own. Part of the reason why that strategy has been successful enough for Russia that it's been able to leave about half of Kyiv without heat and power, in addition to causing similar issues elsewhere in the country, is more to do with Ukraine's allies than Ukraine itself. Just before Russia began subjecting Ukraine's power plants, substations and heating facilities to an almost 24-hour bombing campaign in sub-zero temperatures, Ukraine's allies cut off air defense supplies, Gerdes says. That isn't strictly accurate. The problem was more that those allies didn't provide it enough or failed to get the supplies to Ukraine in time, as Gerdes himself points out. And now there is rumbling from Russia that it may soon start targeting Ukraine's nuclear power stations. In fact, as the Kyiv Independent reported on January 20th, this targeting of nuclear facilities may have already started. Russia going down this route is a huge and potentially catastrophic move. Nuclear catastrophe could result from this approach, and it's something that Ukraine needs to avoid at all costs. It's doing that by strengthening its supply pipelines with its Western allies. Ukraine's relationship with the Czech Republic offers a perfect example on which Gerdes elaborates. Czech President Petr Pavel announced that Prague will soon provide Ukraine with combat planes capable of shooting down drones, Gerdes says. Those planes, which are believed to be the subsonic L-159 jets, offer an example of Ukraine working with its allies to try to get its hands on these types of weapons that it needs, rather than just accepting whatever those allies are willing to give it. We say try because it looks like the Czech initiative has already been shut down. Within days of Pavel's announcement, Reuters reported that the Czech Republic's Prime Minister Andrej Babiš had ruled out the sale or donation of these jets to Ukraine. Unfortunately, Ukraine has been forced to go back to the drawing board on this initiative. However, the spirit behind the move is what matters. What we see here is Ukraine trying to work alongside its allies to get what it needs to fill the gaps that it can't fill on its own. In the case of the Czech jets, Ukraine would have been trying to counterattack Russia's increasing use of long-range attack drones. In 2025, Russia launched about 55,000 of these drones at Ukraine, alongside many thousands more decoy drones designed to throw off Ukraine's air defenses. A gap was discovered and an attempt, albeit a failed one, was made to fill it. There will be other attempts, and this change in philosophy has also been seen elsewhere. Take the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, or PEARL, program as an example. Established following a July 14th meeting between US President Donald Trump and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, PEARL allows Ukraine's allies to purchase weapons from the US. Those weapons are then transferred directly to Ukraine, with the kicker being that Ukraine gets to prioritize what weapons it gets from its allies. Think of it as something similar to a wedding registry, only instead of gravy boats and dishware, Ukraine is receiving air defense missiles, drones, and other equipment that will directly help it to defend itself against the seemingly never-ending Russian onslaught. This focus on what Ukraine needs rather than what its allies believe that it will need is already making a huge difference. On the night of January 19th, Russia unleashed yet another of its massive airstrikes that targeted energy and civilian infrastructure throughout Ukraine. But this time, Ukraine was prepared. Literally the day before the strike happened, Ukraine had received a shipment of air defense missiles, likely for its Patriot systems, that it used to take out the vast majority of the ballistic and cruise missiles that Russia launched. Ukraine hasn't been in a position to stop those types of missiles as well as it did on January 19th, and you can learn all about what it pulled off if you check out our video covering what has to go down as one of the greatest nights for Ukraine's air defenses in recent memory. Efficiency is being built into the pipeline that feeds Western weapons and particularly defensive assets to Ukraine. And it's that mention of efficiency that brings us nicely to the third strategy that Ukraine is now using to topple Russia. We mentioned earlier that the third of these points will perhaps be the most important when it comes to Ukraine's longevity in the battle against Russia. The reason for that is evident from what the strategy is. Ukraine is using its personnel more efficiently than it ever has before. And the perfect example of that efficiency comes from the Kupiansk direction. Russia has been trying to claim that city, which is in the Kharkiv Oblast, for months. both because it provides leverage in peace negotiations and because it can be turned into a logistical node that serves Russia's attempts to progress deeper into Kharkiv and to take the Donbas region. However, Russia's fortunes in that city haven't been great in recent months, and it's due to Ukraine being much more efficient when it comes to how it uses its soldiers. Gerdes explains more, noting that an article in The Times revealed that the casualty ratio between Russia and Ukraine in Kupiansk is catastrophic for Putin. For every one soldier that Ukraine is losing, Russia is losing a staggering 27. These figures are confirmed by The Independent, which also notes that Ukraine's lethal efficiency has led to it almost clearing Kupiansk of Russian soldiers. Right now, Ukraine holds 90% of a city that many thought it would lose during 2025, and it's because Ukraine is getting better at utilizing its soldiers in ways that Russia can't overcome. Gerdes is quick to point out that this insane ratio is only being seen in the Kupiansk direction. However, Russia is losing far more soldiers than it should be in other regions too. Take Pokrovsk as an example. Another city that Putin is desperate to capture. Pokrovsk has been under Russian attack for the better part of 2 years. But there, the Russian front line is verging on total collapse in some places, and it's all because Ukraine has become more efficient in how it's using its soldiers. Some sources say that Russia is now losing 15 soldiers to every 1 Ukrainian loss in Pokrovsk, and you can find out more about why that's happening if you check out our video covering the situation. There are a couple of reasons why these ratios are so important. Gerdes points one of them out, stating, "Now normally, you would maybe want to think of 1 point something to 2 or 1 to 3 at the greatest," he says when talking about what should be expected in a casualty rate between an attacking force and a defending one. And he's right, there even exists the 3-to-1 rule of combat, which states that for an attacker to win a battle, their forces should be at least 3 times the size of the defender's forces. That immediately implies an expected casualty ratio in the 3-to-1 region or less. That's not what we're seeing with Russia because Ukraine has become so efficient at taking out Russia's soldiers without putting its own in the firing line unless it absolutely has to. The drones that we've already spoken about are playing a huge role here. As Forbes noted on January 16th, Ukraine has constantly adapted its strategy to deal with Russian assaults. Part of Ukraine's approach includes the creation of kill zones that are fully loaded with FPV drones. These drones often destroy Russian assaults, or the bulk of them at least, before they ever make it to the fortifications that Russia wants to take. Ukraine anchors these kill zones with squad-sized units that defend these fortifications against anybody who manages to break through, but again, it's about efficiency. Why potentially sacrifice a soldier to do a job that a drone can do? As for the second reason why the massive casualty ratio between Russia and Ukraine is important, it's all to do with something that Ukraine wishes weren't happening. For as effective as Ukraine's defense has been in forcing Putin to burn through his soldiers, Ukraine has suffered plenty of casualties of its own. That's natural after 4 years of fighting, but Ukraine's casualty rate is high enough that it's starting to experience some manpower problems. According to a January 14th CNN report, Fedorov himself has revealed that the Ukrainian military is currently short about 200,000 soldiers who are absent without leave or AWOL. These are all soldiers who have left their positions without first getting permission from their commanders. In Fedorov's own words, another 2 million Ukrainians are wanted for avoiding military service. Ukraine's martial law bans men aged between 23 and 60 from leaving the country, though tens of thousands have done so, CNN says. Others are leaving legally, as the Atlantic Council reported in October. It says that the easing of international travel restrictions on young men between the ages of 18 and 22 a couple of months before its report had already led to 100,000 Ukrainians leaving their country in 2 months. There has been an exodus of potential soldiers from Ukraine, as unpleasant as this is to hear for those people who support the country. However, that only reinforces how important it's become for Ukraine to figure out how to make the most efficient use possible of the soldiers that it has. Drones, particularly those used in the kill zones, appear to be the key. Ukraine countering Russia's infiltration tactics by encircling the infiltrators, as we've seen both in Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, is also important. The more that Ukraine can do with less, the longer it will be able to last against a Russian military that believes it can win the war because it has more soldiers to sacrifice. Finally, we come to the reason why Putin is unable to do anything about these 3 strategic shifts that Ukraine is now exhibiting. And it all comes down to a mindset difference that is proving crucial to Ukraine's ability to cause severe casualties against Russia. Gerdes explains, stating, "What Ukraine has realized, and realized hard, is this. There's a job for everybody. Not everyone belongs in the trench." That is a huge difference from the Russian way of thinking, which seems to be that anybody who enlists with the military is fodder to be sent to the trenches. It's barbarism versus strategy. Asymmetry versus attritional tactics that are holdovers from the glory days of the Russian and Soviet empires. Modern war is fought with logistics, intelligence, training, communications, resilience, and support as much as it is with rifles, Gerdes concludes. Ukraine's understanding of the fact that everybody who is willing to fight has their place, even if that place isn't on the front lines, is the real difference maker. Leaning more heavily into this approach is what we can expect to see in 2026, as lopsided casualty ratios are caused by Ukraine's focusing on internal tech, streamlining its relationship with its allies, and making better use of its people than we've ever seen before. As for Putin, his approach to the war that he started has slowly been grinding his own military and Russia itself into the ground. The end game has begun for Russia's president as he has left himself in a no-win situation where escalation of a war that has grown beyond his control has become the only option. Find out more in our video, and if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more analysis of how Ukraine constantly adapts to the war in front of it, rather than fighting the war that Russia wants it to fight. And thanks for watching.